Look down at the land between two rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates run side by side out of the mountains and down to the sea, and between them lies a flat brown plain the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Today it is mostly Iraq. 6,000 years ago it was the most important place on Earth. Here, for the first time anywhere, human beings stopped wandering and built cities. Here they invented writing, the wheel for the potter, the plough, the law court, the school, and the 24-hour day you still live by. Every empire you have ever heard of learned its trade here first, and yet almost nobody remembers the names. You know Egypt and its pyramids, you know Rome and its legions, but do you know Sumer, Akkad, Ur? For 3,000 years the whole story of civilization was written here, in wet clay, by people whose language no one would speak for 2 millennia. This is that story, from the first mud brick to the last king, from the first city to the fall of Babylon. It begins with mud, water, and a very simple, very dangerous idea. What if we stayed? Understand why anyone would settle here, you have to understand the mud. Twice a year the rivers flooded and spread a thin skin of black silt across the plain, and in that silt almost anything would grow. But there was a catch. This far south it barely rained, so the water had to be carried to the fields by hand, then by ditch, then by canal. And a canal is not something one family can dig alone. To eat, the first southerners had to cooperate on a scale no humans ever had before. Villages of reed huts and mud brick houses appeared along the channels, and by 7,000 years ago one culture, which we call the Ubaid, spread its distinctive painted pottery across the whole region. They drained marshes, dug irrigation, and raised the first temples, small mud platforms where they fed offerings to gods who, they believed, owned the land and the water. Population grew. Villages swelled into towns. Some of those temples rose taller with every rebuilding, layer upon layer, until they loomed over everything around them. Something new was taking shape on the plain, something the world had never seen. It was about to become the first city on Earth. Its name was Uruk, and around 5,500 years ago it exploded. In a world of villages, Uruk grew to hold perhaps 40,000 people behind 6 miles of walls, a density of human beings that had simply never existed. Walk its streets, and you would have seen something dizzyingly modern. Crowds of strangers, markets, workshops, and at the center 2 vast temple complexes rising above the rooftops. To feed and organize so many, the city needed specialists. For the first time a person could be only a potter, only a weaver, only a priest, only a soldier, and trust that someone else would grow the grain. This is the true birth of civilization, the moment humans divided their labor and multiplied their power. Uruk's culture spread up the rivers in a wave of trade and imitation, planting colonies hundreds of miles away. Its potters even invented the fast wheel, spinning out bowls by the thousand. But a city of 40,000 strangers has a problem no village ever faced. How do you keep track of who owns what, who owes what, who paid and who did not, when you cannot possibly know everyone? The answer they found would change the human mind forever. It began, unglamorously, with accounting. Temple officials needed to record deliveries of grain, sheep, and oil, so they pressed little pictures into tablets of wet clay, a drawing of an ox head for an ox, an ear of barley for barley. At first, these were just reminders, pictures of things. But then someone made a leap so large we can barely imagine a world before it. They realized a sign could stand not for a thing, but for a sound. Now you could write anything you could say. A name, a promise, a poem, a lie. Scribes turned the pictures on their sides and pressed them with a cut reed, leaving the wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform, the first true writing on Earth. Learning it took years, so scribes became a powerful, literate elite, and schools appeared to train them, complete with homework, tests, and complaints about strict teachers scratched into the clay. Suddenly a king's word could travel 100 miles unchanged. History itself became possible, because for the first time human beings could speak to people they would never meet, including you, 4,000 years later, reading their shopping lists and their prayers. And the first thing history recorded was war. By around 4,500 years ago, the southern plain was carved up between a dozen rival cities. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Kish, Umma, each with its own god, its own temple, and its own king. This is Sumer, the world's first civilization, and it was anything but peaceful. The cities fought endlessly over land and water, and from that warfare rose a new kind of man, the Lugal, the big man, the king, who led in battle and ruled from a palace beside the temple. One of them, a king of Uruk named Gilgamesh, was remembered so vividly that his story became the world's oldest surviving epic, a tale of a hero who builds great walls, kills a monster, loses his only friend, and goes searching in vain for the secret of eternal life. The Sumerians buried their greatest with staggering wealth, gold helmets, lyres, and in the death pits of Ur, dozens of servants who seemed to have followed their masters into the grave. They gave us the wheel, the sailing boat, the plough, and mathematics built on the number 60, which is why an hour still has 60 minutes. But their squabbling cities were about to meet a conqueror from the north. His name was Sargon, and according to legend, he began with nothing. The story says he was born in secret to a priestess, set adrift on the river in a basket of reeds, and raised by a gardener, a tale you may find strangely familiar. Rising as cupbearer to a king he then overthrew, Sargon built a new capital called Akkad, and did something no one ever had. He conquered not one city, but all of them, welding the rival states of Sumer into the world's first true empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. He installed his own governors, spread his Akkadian language, and made his daughter high priestess of the moon god, and her hymns are the oldest poetry we can name an author for. To hold it together, he kept a standing army, boasting that 5,400 men ate before him every day. For over a century, his dynasty ruled the known world, and his grandson Naram-Sin went further still, declaring himself not merely a king but a living god. It seemed unstoppable, an empire of the four quarters of the earth. And then, quite suddenly, it fell apart, and the people blamed a curse. Why did the first empire die? The Akkadians told a story, that Naram-Sin had angered the gods by sacking a great temple, and that they sent a wild mountain people, the Gutians, to punish the land, so that grain sold for impossible prices, and the dead lay unburied. Modern scientists reading mud and ice have found something chilling behind the legend, evidence of a brutal, century-long drought that dried the northern fields and sent refugees flooding south. Whatever the cause, Akkad fell so completely that its capital has never been found. Into the chaos, after the Gutians were driven out, rose one last great Sumerian revival. The city of Ur, under a dynasty we call Ur III, rebuilt the empire and ran it like a machine. Its king Ur-Nammu raised the towering staircase to heaven we call the Ziggurat, whose ruins still stand, and issued the oldest surviving law code, older than Hammurabi by 3 centuries. Armies of scribes recorded everything, every sheep, every sandal, every worker, in tens of thousands of tablets. But this perfect bureaucracy was brittle. Famine, invasion, and rebellion tore it apart within a lifetime, and the last king of Ur was dragged away in chains. Sumer would never rule again. For 3 centuries after Ur, the plains splintered again into warring kingdoms, and power drifted north to a once unremarkable town beside the Euphrates. Its name was Babylon. For years, it was just one player among many, until it came under a patient, cunning king named Hammurabi. For most of his long reign, he built canals, temples, and walls and bided his time. Then, late in life, he struck. In a whirlwind of campaigns, he crushed his rivals one by one, until he ruled all of Mesopotamia from a single throne. But Hammurabi is remembered less for his conquests than for a black stone pillar, taller than a man, carved with nearly 300 laws. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that famous, brutal principle is his. His code fixed the price of an ox, the wages of a builder, and the punishment for betrayal, and it declared its purpose was so that the strong might not oppress the weak. Whether it worked is another matter, but it survives, and you can still see it today. Yet Babylon's golden age was fragile. Within a generation of Hammurabi's death, his empire was crumbling, and a strange new enemy was about to appear from the mountains. It came out of the north in the year we would call 1595 before Christ. The Hittites, a warlike people from Anatolia who had mastered the light war chariot, swept down the Euphrates, smashed into Babylon, looted its temples, and carried off the statue of its great god Marduk. Then, strangely, they simply went home, leaving the greatest city in the world leaderless. Into that vacuum moved the Kassites, another mountain people, who seized Babylon, and then, remarkably, ruled it in peace for over 400 years, the longest single dynasty in its history. This was an age of great powers writing letters to one another: Egypt, the Hittites, Assyria, Babylon, kings addressing each other as brother, trading gold for lapis lazuli, marrying their daughters into rival courts. It was the world's first age of diplomacy, and we can read the letters, baked hard in a fire that destroyed the palace holding them, because that fire was a warning. Around 3,200 years ago, the whole eastern Mediterranean convulsed. Cities burned, kingdoms vanished, and a mysterious wave of raiders, the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, wrecked the old order. Out of that darkness, a terrifying new power was rising in the north. To the north, on the upper Tigris around the city of Ashur, lived a hardy, stubborn people named for their god. For centuries, the Assyrians had been merchants, running donkey caravans of tin and cloth across the mountains to trade. But their homeland had no natural defenses, no marshes or deserts to hide behind, only enemies on every side, and that shaped them into something hard. To survive, Assyria had to fight, and slowly it learned to fight better than anyone alive. Under a line of warrior kings, it began to expand, first securing its heartland, then pushing outward in campaign after campaign every single year. Where earlier empires had ruled loosely, the Assyrians ruled with iron. They deported whole conquered peoples, hundreds of thousands of them, marching them across the empire to break their spirit and mix their bloodlines. They demanded tribute and crushed rebellion without mercy, and they made sure everyone knew it, carving boastful accounts of their brutality into palace walls. This was becoming the most feared war machine the world had yet produced, but it was still only a regional power. Over the next few centuries, it would grow into something monstrous, an empire that would swallow the entire Near East. Its golden, terrible age was coming. By around 700, before Christ, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had become the largest the world had ever seen, reaching from the mountains of Iran to the banks of the Nile. Its army was a revolution. Where others fielded farmers with spears, Assyria built a professional force of iron-armed infantry, cavalry, and siege engineers with battering rams and towers that could crack any city open. No wall was safe. Kings like Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon II, and Sennacherib campaigned relentlessly, and their palaces at Nimrud and Nineveh were decorated with carved stone panels showing exactly what happened to those who resisted. Cities aflame, prisoners impaled, rivers of the defeated. This was terror state policy, and it worked because it was written down and shown off. Yet these same brutal kings were also builders and collectors. Sennacherib turned Nineveh into a wonder, with palaces, gardens watered by miles of stone aqueduct, and 18 canals, a city some think inspired the later legend of hanging gardens. The empire grew rich beyond imagining on the tribute of 100 conquered lands. But an empire built on fear needs endless victories to survive. When the conquest slowed, the whole vast structure would come under strain. First, though, came its brief, dazzling peak. The last great king of Assyria was Ashurbanipal, and unusually for a warrior, he could read. He ruled at the empire's height, crushing a devastating civil war against his own brother in Babylon and sacking the ancient Egyptian city of Thebes, extending Assyrian power as far as it would ever reach. He had himself carved hunting lions from a chariot, and those reliefs, the dying lioness dragging her paralyzed legs, are among the most breathtaking works of the ancient world. But his true monument was made of clay. At Nineveh, Ashurbanipal assembled the first systematically collected library in history, sending agents across the empire to copy every text they could find. Over 30,000 tablets were gathered there, covering medicine, astronomy, omens, dictionaries, and literature. And when the palace finally burned, that fire did not destroy the library, it baked it hard and preserved it for us. It is there, in the ashes of Nineveh, that archaeologists found the epic of Gilgamesh, and within it, a story of a great flood, a man told to build a boat and save his family and the animals, a story written centuries before the Bible. Ashurbanipal thought he had built something eternal. He was catastrophically wrong. Within 30 years of Ashurbanipal's death, the greatest empire on earth simply ceased to exist. How? The answer is that Assyria had made too many enemies and stretched itself too thin. Every conquered people hated it, and two of them decided to finish it together. From the south rose Babylon, restless and proud, under a chieftain named Nabopolassar. From the east came the Medes, a fierce people of the Iranian highlands. In the year 612, before Christ, their combined armies fell upon Nineveh, the mightiest city in the world, and after a brutal siege they took it. They burned it, tore down its walls, and slaughtered its people with the same fury Assyria had taught them. The destruction was so complete that within 2 centuries a Greek general marched past the mound and had no idea a great city had ever stood there. The name of Assyria, terror of nations, became a byword for arrogant power brought low. But nature abhors a vacuum, and the biggest winner was Babylon, reborn and hungry. Its new king was about to make it, for one last brilliant moment, the most magnificent city the ancient world had ever seen. His name would echo for 3,000 years. His name was Nebuchadnezzar II, and he ruled Babylon for over 40 years at the peak of its glory. With Assyria gone, he inherited its empire and its wars, marching west into the Levant, where in the year 587 before Christ he besieged and destroyed Jerusalem, burned its temple, and carried its people off to Babylon, an exile the Bible never forgot. But it is the city itself that stunned the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt Babylon on a scale of pure spectacle. He raised the Ishtar Gate, glazed in brilliant blue and studded with golden dragons and bulls, opening onto a grand processional way. He restored the towering ziggurat that legend turned into the Tower of Babel, and he is said to have built, for a homesick queen, the hanging gardens, terraces of trees and flowers watered high above the desert, counted among the 7 wonders of the world, though no one has ever found a trace of them. Babylon became a city of perhaps 200,000 people, a wonder of blue walls and golden temples. It seemed the eternal center of the world. But it would fall not to an army at its gates, but to something far quieter and cleverer. The man who took Babylon barely had to fight for it. His name was Cyrus, king of the Persians, a people from the highlands of Iran, who in a single generation had built an empire even larger than Assyria's. By the year 539, before Christ, only Babylon stood in his way. Its last king, Nabonidus, was unpopular, an eccentric who had abandoned the city for years to worship the moon god in the desert and had neglected the great festival of Marduk. According to the Babylonians' own accounts, when Cyrus arrived, the city opened its gates almost without a struggle, and the Greek historians tell a tale of the Persians diverting the river to march in along its bed. Either way, the last native empire of Mesopotamia ended not with a massacre but with a shrug, and Cyrus did something unexpected. Rather than burning and deporting, he presented himself as a liberator, restored the temples, and let the exiled peoples go home, including the Jews, who remembered him as God's anointed. His words survive on a clay cylinder some call the first charter of human rights. Mesopotamia was now just one province of somebody else's empire. It would never rule itself again. For the next 200 years, the land between the rivers belonged to Persia, and in truth, for the ordinary farmer, little changed. The canals still had to be dug, the barley still had to be harvested, the scribes still pressed their reeds into clay, the priests still fed Marduk in his temple. Babylon remained one of the greatest cities in the Persian Empire, a favored royal residence where the kings spent their winters, and it was still enormously rich, taxed heavily precisely because it could pay. But the center of power had moved for good to Persian cities like Persepolis and Susa hundreds of miles to the east. Mesopotamia's kings now answered to a foreign emperor, its tribute flowed outward, and its ancient language began slowly to die. Aramaic, the simpler alphabet of traders, spread across the empire and pushed the old wedge writing to the margins, kept alive only by a shrinking circle of temple scholars. The civilization that had invented writing was starting to forget how to write. Twice Babylon rebelled against Persian rule, and twice it was crushed. And then, from the west, came a young Macedonian who would conquer the entire Persian Empire before his 33rd birthday, and who dreamed of making Babylon his capital. In the year 331 before Christ, Alexander of Macedon shattered the Persian army and marched, unopposed, into Babylon. The city welcomed him with garlands, and he was captivated. He ordered its great ziggurat rebuilt, sacrificed to Marduk, and declared that Babylon would be the capital of his new world empire, the meeting point of East and West. It might have been the city's third golden age, but it was not to be. In the year 323, at just 32 years old, Alexander fell ill and died in Nebuchadnezzar's own palace, and his generals tore his empire apart. Mesopotamia fell to one of them, Seleucus, whose dynasty would rule it for a century and a half. The Seleucids built a brand new Greek capital, Seleucia, on the Tigris, and the population and prestige of ancient Babylon began to drain away into it. Greek became the language of power. Greek gods stood beside Marduk, and the old temples slowly emptied. Yet in those same temples, a handful of astronomer priests were still watching the sky, keeping records they had kept for 700 years, laying the mathematical foundations Greek science would build upon. The old knowledge was not quite dead, but the old world was ending. The Greeks did not hold it long. In the 2nd century before Christ, horsemen from the east, the Parthians, wrested Mesopotamia away, and for the next 700 years the land became the frontier between two rival superpowers, first Parthia, then the Sassanid Persians, locked in endless war with Rome. Armies marched across the old plain again and again, and Roman emperors sacked its cities for glory. Somewhere in these centuries, the last cuneiform tablet was written, an astronomical text, and with it, the world's first writing system, 3,000 years old, fell silent, unread by anyone for the next 2,000 years. On the Tigris, the Persians raised a vast new capital, Ctesiphon, whose colossal brick arch still stands, the widest of its kind ever built. Then, in the 7th century after Christ, everything changed once more. Out of Arabia surged the armies of a new faith, Islam, and in a handful of stunning years, they overwhelmed the exhausted Sassanid Empire. Mesopotamia became part of the Islamic world, and soon its very heart. For beside the Tigris, a new city was about to be founded, one that would inherit the region's ancient role as the center of the world. Its name was Baghdad, and what became of the land between the rivers. Under Baghdad it blazed one last time, becoming the center of a golden age of science and learning, before Mongol armies sacked the city in the year 1258 and threw its libraries into the Tigris until the river ran black with ink. The ancient cities became silent mounds of mud brick, their names forgotten, until 19th century archaeologists dug them up and letter by letter cracked the code of cuneiform, and a lost world spoke again. And what a world! Every time you write a word, you use their invention. Every time you check the time, you count in their base of 60, 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees in a circle. When you sit in a court of law, sign a contract, go to school, ride in a wheeled vehicle, or read a story about a great flood or a hero who defies death, you are living in the shadow of Sumer. They were the first to do almost everything, and then they were forgotten, buried under the very mud they had tamed. But the ideas survived, passed hand to hand across 4,000 years, all the way down to you. Everything began here.